This is the Anthrobiology Podcast, hosted by me, Gabby LaPera. Every 2 weeks, I interview a biological anthropologist about what makes us, us. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. I am excited and a little bit nervous for this episode. In this episode, I interviewed Dr. Rachel Watkins of American University, and she was a fabulous interview, but one of the main thing that we talk about in this show is race, which I know can be a really hard topic to handle, which is why I was so glad that Dr. Watkins was such an incredibly thoughtful and actually very funny interviewee. Unfortunately, this show ran pretty long. The interview ran pretty long, so I had to cut out some of the funniest moments and some really interesting discussions about how biological anthropologists use race in the field today that I'm hoping to actually put into a kind of bigger episode about race later on. But here are the things you need to know about this episode. Dr. Watkins wrote this paper. It's called An Alternative Perspective on Historical Bioarchaeology. It is available for free on the internet. As usual, I will post a link on the website. And her motivation in deciding to write this paper was that she had been working as a biological anthropologist for a long time, and she did all the regular things biological anthropologists do, right? The things that we think of when we think about biological anthropology, looking at bioarchaeological sites and determining height and pathology and all of that stuff. And one day she read this paper by a social scientist who basically said that scientists and social scientists really have a responsibility to talk about race in their field so that everyone as a whole can get better. And that really stuck with her, and that is what motivated her to write this paper. In the paper, it's written in pretty academic language. I still encourage you to read it if you want to get insight into what we were talking about. But what it really boils down to is to these four main thoughts. First, there is a lack of people of color in sciences and social sciences, which is no good because it's really important to have a diversity of thought in order to push anything forward. Secondly, sometimes research from researchers of color is seen as less widely applicable, which may be for a variety of reasons, but is in fact something that I have occasionally encountered in the field. A long time ago, granted, but potentially still a problem today. Third, there's this idea that is pervasive both in certain parts of American society as well as in certain scientific circles that we're beyond racism. It's a problem of the past. We're all enlightened. We all agree that being racist is bad, so why are we still harping on it? And that can be a pretty destructive point of view to have, especially because we're not over it. To those people, I strongly encourage them to learn more about unconscious bias. If you'd like to learn more, there's actually a website that is hosted by Harvard called Implicit Bias. You can take a test, learn more about that. And fourth, there is a lack of consideration for the remains of people of color in their historic context and for their modern descended related communities. This is actually a really interesting topic for me because there's actually been a fair amount of legislation for Native Americans to help them reclaim a lot of the remains that ended up in museums. But it's not something that's really necessarily talked about that often with other minority groups. And that's a real pity. And it's actually something that I had legitimately never thought about until I talked to Dr. Watkins, which I guess just uncovers some of my own unconscious bias. Anyway, I know that this episode can bring up a lot of heavy feelings, and if you want to talk about it, feel free to shoot me an email at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. I hope you really enjoy the show, and if you do like it, please leave a rating and a review so other people can find it too. All right, have a good time. Hello, everyone. This is Gabby LaPera, and joining me on the phone is Dr. Rachel Watkins of American University. Hello, Dr. Watkins.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. I was hoping you could tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you study.
Sure. So I am an associate professor of anthropology at American University. I am trained as a biocultural anthropologist. That's how I self-identify. So I'm somebody whose primary training was in skeletal biology and kind of looking at how human biology reflects how people are culturally embedded. And from there, I've gone on to do research that is related but kind of extends my inquiry into looking at the social history of how collections are put together and also the intellectual histories that inform the research that's carried out on these collections. And so a lot of what I do now, given where I am in my career and mentoring master's and doctoral students and other things, I'm really invested in doing work that promotes inclusive intellectual histories of American biological anthropology. So that means, taking a look at and giving consideration to the wide range of scholarship, especially scholarship on the part of people of color that have contributed to, where our field is today.
Yeah, and you, in preparation for this interview, you actually sent me a forthcoming paper that you have coming out in, is it the Society for Historic Archaeology journal?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it was kind of a revelation to me. It was a lot of stuff that we, or at least when I was in school, which granted was a long time ago, was something. It was just things that we didn't really talk about. And I kind of want to unpack a little bit of what you said about being a biocultural anthropologist and understanding the position of race in our field. So understanding how culture can leave biological markers on skeletons. So that's definitely something that you've done in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And then what you're interested in now. I'm just kind of unpacking this for people who aren't used to academic language. The things that you're interested in now is kind of understanding where we came from as a discipline, biological anthropology, where we are now, and kind of trying to help shape a framework for our future that's more inclusive and is more scientifically rigorous as a result.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And I have no problem saying flat out that this is something that happened by way of me reaching a kind of saturation point where my frustration was concerned. Being one of the few people of color, especially, Black folks in bioanthropology, being asked to contribute to special issues and things of that sort. I'm always happy to do it. But I kind of reached a point where I thought to myself, we talk about all of these methodological and theoretical innovations, that we're implementing, while there are aspects of social relations, regarding our research that stay the same. So, we have all these innovations going on in terms of how we look at biocultural interfaces, but it's still happening in laboratories and in research spaces where there's a dearth of people of color. And so that's kind of where I started. Paper was actually supposed to be very much so focused on a project of mine where I collect data and I talk about that and I talk about my methods and analyze it.
Right, doing the things that everyone thinks of when they think of biological anthropology, right? Like they think of you looking at skeletons and taking data and then analyzing it.
Yes, right, right. And so that's what I was asked to do. But every time I sat down to do that, it was just not possible for me to carry it out. And it was because of, as I said, this frustration. And so finally I said, you know what? I'm actually going to write about this. Somebody needs to say we should not continue applauding ourselves for these methodological and theoretical innovations when we are not addressing these problems that are associated with epistemological underpinnings of our field, meaning
Going to ask you one second, what is epistemological?
that's just a fancy way of saying that there are these norms that have been in place since the beginning of the field that kind of set a standard about who can be a part of the canon, who's a part of the canon, whose research is considered canonical, whose research is considered to be broadly applicable in the field versus research that's thought to be too culturally specific to be broadly applicable in the field. So, my point is that there are all of these norms that are not contested while we're kind of engaged in all of these innovations. And I wanted to write a paper that provided the opportunity for us to kind of back things up and talk about these norms that continue to have a rather unfortunate impact on scientific practice in biological anthropology and elsewhere that have to do with the dearth of people of color in the field.
And I think you certainly succeeded. Like, I read this paper, it'll come out probably is that the October issue?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's September now. You all will probably listen to this in February of 2020. It's a little bit traveling back in time. But I think it's definitely I think you've accomplished it in your paper for sure. I feel like I learned a lot, and it really opened my mind in a way that I'd never really thought about the discipline critically like this before. I think it's some things that I kind of thought about a little bit. Like, I'd gotten a scholarship one time as a Latina in biological anthropology, but I didn't really think about what that meant and like why that existed. And reading your paper really contextualized a lot of experiences for me. I will say it's dense. So especially if you are not familiar with academic language and like thinking about things this way, it could be like a little bit intimidating, but I strongly encourage you, if you get a chance to read it, to read it.
Yes, and also in keeping with my sense of obligation to make sure that these discussions can be a part of the wider discussions among the general public, that they should be. My plan is to write a piece that doesn't have a companion piece where these issues are taken up that's more broadly accessible.
Great. When you complete that, can you shoot that over to me and I'll put it up on my site too?
Okay.
Great. Great. Okay, so after having read your paper, I kind of think that you identified 4 major problem areas that we need to think about. And the first is a lack of people of color within the discipline. And this is something I've certainly experienced myself. Do you have any kind of context for people on why that might be so and what's going on with that?
Sure. So I think that there's a deep history to it, or one that's associated with deep time, and then there's a more immediate history to it. So I think that historically, as I mentioned in the paper, people of color are the research subjects. They're the focal point of the gaze of biological anthropologists. And this isn't something that's just specific to biological anthropology or the field of anthropology, period. And so that notion that people of color in the field are research subjects is rather naturalized. And so people who are interested, people of color who have a desire to pursue some sort of field of research or in some academic field, there are some people who are very clearly not going to be interested in anthropology because of the history associated with it. And the responses to that history are actually built into the academic structures of some historically Black colleges and universities, for instance.
And I just want to clarify real quick for people, when you say like the history of biological anthropology, I think that one of the most frequent and justified charges laid at the feet of biological anthropology is that we helped create and perpetuate scientific racism for a long time. And I think that's a hard thing to grapple with and be in that discipline as a person of color.
It absolutely is. And it is why I very much so understand why at, for instance, Howard University, which is a historically Black college that I attended, when the institution was developing its social sciences programs, sociology was the focal point, not anthropology, because anthropology was known to be that field where, you have these European folks going over and studying natives as if they were aliens, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a tradition that has in some ways continued. Looking into the present, you see a lot of people of color who are indeed interested in some of the major research questions that we take on within biological anthropology. But it's quite a burden to be a part of a field where there aren't a lot of people of color. And if you know you can go into, say, again, medical sociology or public health and take up these same questions with a broader demographic of researchers, well, that makes perfect sense in many ways. So you have that, you have patterns that reflect people's awareness of the dearth of people of color in the field and the history of the field, the role that it played in constructing this concept of biological race and there being racial hierarchies.
And I want you to express in your own words why is it a problem that there isn't a diversity of people in biological anthropology? Why is that a problem for us as a field?
Yeah, so it's a problem because it reflects the ways in which the field has remained the same, in spite of not being a field that focuses on typifying race, racial typologies and classifications. If the ways in which the research is being carried out reflect the social relations that were in place, right, at the time that the field was established, then that means that there's a way that those norms are continuing to inform the field.
Mm-hmm.
The norm that people of color, it's normative for people of color to be the research subjects, and for people who are not people of color to be the researchers, right? And so it's a problem because that means that that's a way that this kind of old biological anthropology is being reinscribed in the laboratory and onto the bodies, the very bodies of the researchers who are of color. It's very important to change the social relations within the laboratory, within the research space, if we really want to bring about the methodological and theoretical innovation to which we're committed. It can't happen without those social relations shifting.
Definitely. And there's two things that come to mind when you're saying that to me. One is that I think that a diversity of thought is really important to making sure that any new discoveries are robustly analyzed, because if everyone's thinking the same way, then kind of what's the point? And then secondly, the other thing that I've been thinking about as you're talking is how exhausting it can be as a person of color in a field to constantly be held up as a representative and as an ambassador, and how difficult
Right.
that must be.
Yes, and that is why I chose to take a page from the book of my cultural anthropologist friends and include a positionality statement, because yes, that's something that typically cultural anthropologists talk about, their positionality in terms of their research. And one of the things that I argue is that there needs to be more ethnographic visibility of the social relations within biological anthropology, and that's one of the ways in which it needs to happen. People need to be more considerate of their positionality, the ways in which they're bringing their various histories of power or oppression to the laboratory, and how that's going to inform research. Also, there's a way in which we talk about diversity today, especially when it's separated from equity. When we talk about diversity and inclusion just kind of being a great thing in general. When we're talking about considering the contributions of people of color across the board to various fields, including biological anthropology, it isn't about just a diversity of thought for the sake of diversity, but there's a way in which people have translated their embodied experiences into some very profound intellectual insight. People who are both, for instance, living with, having to deal with social inequalities as well as studying them. There are ways in which those folks are able to contribute to the ways in which bodies are theorized, biocultural interrelationships are theorized. that are very valuable to everybody, not just the people of color. And so that's another reason why we need to have more of a critical mass of people of color in the laboratory, in research across the board, because that critical mass is going to help to make visible, yeah, this isn't just about diversity is a good thing, but there are particular perspectives that folks are bringing to the table that haven't been considered. It's very similar to the very important innovations that feminists of color brought to feminist studies, and certainly within anthropology. And so, what we have today are feminist anthropological studies that are not only kind of critical of normative gender relations in general, but also critical of Western norms around gender. These are the things that come out of people having embodied experiences, right, that lend to being aware of these sorts of kind of nuances and the intricacies of inequalities. That's much more than just general diversity. That's extremely valuable. And
Right. It's bringing rigor. It's really bringing rigor to the field.
exactly, exactly.
And actually, something else I wanted to pull out of there, which is another problem
Mhm.
that you mentioned in your paper, is that frequently the research created by people of color is not considered broadly applicable. It's like, oh, yeah, like that's for like that's something for Native Americans or that's something for blacks. Like it's not considered.
Right. No, I mean, and there are even little monikers like, oh, that's me search, not research, it's me search. Yeah, it's horrendous. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
Which is
Hmm.
wild. But yeah, I think definitely having kind of a momentum, like a certain, like almost just like a quorum, you need like a certain minimum level in order to really push us into the next place, which is, again,
Right.
getting back to that paper, the third problem that you identified, which is that as a discipline, we kind of think we're beyond racism. We kind of feel like we've addressed it and we've moved on and like why are we still talking about this? And which
Yeah.
blows my mind. I don't know, have you ever
Yes.
read Confederates in the Attic by Tony Horowitz?
No.
It's this man who moves to Virginia in the 90s and he gets there and he's like, wow, everyone still really cares about the Civil War in the South. And so he goes on
Oh,
this whole exploration of like how the South still lives the Civil War every day. And this is in the 1990s, so it's like a little bit out of date.
yeah.
But he talks to everyone from reenactors to white supremacists. It's really
Yeah.
interesting, and it really illustrate to people. And I think that this is something that's common not just in biological anthropology, but in a lot of fields and in society as a whole, that there's a lot of people who are like, the Civil War, civil rights. Like, didn't we already solve that already? Wasn't that a problem for the 60s? And I think that movements like Black Lives Matter and other ones are trying to tell us, like, no, this is still relevant. This is still something that we need to think about and talk about and struggle against.
Absolutely. There's some deeper digging to do.
Mm-hmm.
So we as biological anthropologists no longer embrace the realities of a biological notion of race. Just because we've deconstructed that doesn't mean that, and we like to say, well, we recognize scientific racism now. And that doesn't mean that we have addressed the structural inequalities in our field, that continued dearth of people of color in the field. Absolutely.
One of the last problem, like big problem that you identified, is that there's also a lack of consideration of the human remains that we study in the context of them historically and how that population was treated historically, and also how the modern descendants of those communities are treated now. And this was
Mhm.
really interesting too, especially within the context of the New York African Burial Ground Project, where you really created a community area that had this whole dialogue with anthropologists in a way that you don't really, with biological anthropologists that you don't really ever see. And I thought that was so interesting. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, and to start, I will say we had nothing to do with creating that community. That community established itself. These were a people, stakeholders, concerned citizens, um, who saw what was happening, saw that these bones were being unearthed in secret, and taken away in secret, who had extreme concerns and engaged in all sorts of civil disobedience and awareness raising to get excavation halted and to make sure that now that they were unearthed, that some robust research would take place around them, that the remains would be studied in a way that reflected the unique opportunity they presented to understand biological and social life at the cusp of, right, or on the cusp of this emergence of, this cultural formation known as being African American. That was all the community. And so they position themselves as a force to be rightly reckoned with, such that, they were not merely consulted after researchers, both biological and cultural anthropologists, made decisions about research questions and research design, but they held researchers accountable to seeking out their input, in the development of research questions and design. And thanks to them, and this is something that Michael Blakey, who was the scientific director of the project, always points out, and I always try to echo it in the things that I write. If not for the descendant community emphasizing the fact that here's an opportunity to, not only look at the biological consequences of enslavement, but to look at these people as folks who had a life before enslavement. This is one of the unique opportunities we have. If not for them insisting upon that, it's highly likely that the sorts of research questions that allow us to get at those things wouldn't have been asked, right? And so this is why the Burial Ground Project was grounded in this, what Michael Blakey called an ethical epistemology, the development of knowledge by way of research questions and other aspects of research design in a way that's ethical, meaning considering the priorities and the considerations of the ethical clients who were the descendant community, the members
which
of the descendant community.
which probably made it in a practical sense more difficult to carry out the research, but in the sense of the actual results and the community building that was established, much more rewarding.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, kind of speaking to some of the issues that I raise in the paper, it actually wasn't more difficult. It made it more robust.
Mm-hmm.
This is
Mm-hmm.
actually how research should be taking place. This is actually how knowledge creation should happen. There shouldn't be some of the hierarchies that are in place in the process of knowledge creation aren't necessarily helpful.
Yeah.
So, what the project modeled was that you can destabilize that relationship and not only end up with a really great project, but one that's actually more robust, more intellectually rigorous than you would have had maintaining those power dynamics.
Which is the same note that we've talked about with each and every single one of the problems, quote unquote problem. Oh, no, actually not quote unquote, the problems that we discussed throughout our conversation. That
Yeah.
having that mixing is just making us better and stronger. Okay,
Yeah.
so I am going to wrap this up. So here are my final 3 questions. Frequently, people tell me these are the hardest 3 questions of the interview.
Okay.
The first question is, everything that we talked about today, if someone wanted to learn more, like kind of at the beginner level, is there a book or an article that you'd recommend that they read?
I actually would. And it's the book that actually sparked my interest in anthropology. I don't know if there's a new edition out, but it's Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Man. I think it does a very good job
What a
of,
great book.
yeah, yeah, it does such a great job of talking about science as a social practice.
Perfect. Okay, I will put a link to that on the
Yeah.
website once the show is up. Second question, what are you reading for work right now?
What am I reading for? I am reading, you know what I'm doing now, which I really love? I have the pleasure of reading the work of other colleagues. So there are there's a group of us who are kind of at similar stages in our careers who are in the process of writing things or revising things, and we're all reading each other's stuff.
Oh, that's wonderful. Third question. Are you reading anything for fun right now?
Yeah, I always do. Everybody knows I'm like I'm all into sci-fi and all kinds of various, all kinds of fiction. I love reading novels and usually have to do that to help stay sane. So I will admit though, I've only read like one page because I'm doing this other stuff, but I swear I really do commit. I read quite a bit, but I'm starting to read a book by a Native American author. The title of the book is called There, There, and one of my Native American colleagues hipped me to it.
Okay, cool. I'll put a link
Yeah,
up to that on the website too.
please do. Please do. Please do. Yeah.
I just finished reading James Herriot's All Creatures Great and Small because I really needed a break from the news cycle. It's about a country vet in the Yorkshire Dales of England in the 40s and 50s. It's a lot of his stories about delivering baby cows, and it's wonderful.
Look, absolutely. I think the last book I read before There, which is by Tommy Orange, by the way, was one of Stephen King's new books.
Oh, man, I haven't read anything from King in a long time.
It's not a new book. It's the sequel to The Shining. That's what I read.
I didn't know. I had no idea there was a sequel to that. Okay, well, anyway, I have taken up over 45 minutes of your time. It was really nice talking to you, and if I ever do that Mystery Science Theater 3000 thing for Bones, I will definitely hit you up.
You must. You have to.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much, and have a great day.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Thanks for joining me for this episode of the Anthrobiology Podcast. If you have questions or comments, you can reach me at gabby.lapera@anthrobiology.com. That's spelled GABY.LAPERA@anthrobiology.com. This show was produced and edited by me. Music courtesy of Chad Crouch, aka Poddington Bear at Sound of Picture.